very good morning to everybody. It gives me great pleasure on behalf of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies at the Maharaja Sayajirao Rao University of Baroda in Vadodara. Welcome you to our first book discussion series. Now, since we are a relatively young institution, before I go on to the book and our eminent speakers, I'll just take a minute to explain our institute. Now, this is actually very brand new. It was set up with funding from the Gujarat government. Idea was to create a think tank in Gujarat, Western Coast, so that all strategic thinking is not limited to the city of Delhi. Nothing against Delhi, a lot of us are Delhi-based, but the idea is to catch the regional flavor also. That was the whole idea. But before we could really take off, of course, COVID hit us hard. After a year of waiting, we realized that this is the new normal and we should not wait anymore. So we are launching our website hopefully next week. We've started a series of lectures on, since our topic is public policy and international studies. So we do a series of lectures every Friday, alternately on public policy and on international studies. Of course, initially we did one with our fellow school of disaster management in the MS University. Can I request others to mute themselves? I can do it, but doesn't look nice. Okay, thank you. Now, we did one on disaster risk to resilience on the 5th of June. This was one-off with our Center for Disaster Management, with Dr. Anil Gupta. From the 11th, we've been doing our regular Friday series. Our first one was on a panel discussion on the 11th of June. It had Tanvi Madan, Garima Mohan, and Darshana Barua. And we spoke on Indian foreign policy post-pandemic. Then on the 18th of June, Dr. Shamika Ravi, she spoke on COVID-19, India's real economy. This was an eye-opener for many of us. On the 25th of June, Dr. Medha Bisht, who's worked on Kautilya at the IDSA, she spoke on Kautilya's Arthashastra, Insights on Strategy. On the 2nd of July, last week, we had Dr. Ashima Goel, a very prominent economist, speak on COVID-19 recovery and macroeconomic risks from the emerging market perspective. So we're looking at India and beyond. On this Friday, 9th, Antara Ghoshal Singh, who's worked on China extensively, will be speaking on China's strategic discourse on India in the backdrop of LAC crisis. On the 16th of July, Dr. Dipankar Sengupta would be speaking on public expenditures in Jammu and Kashmir and comparing the outcomes with the inputs and basically showing that there has been a fair amount of distortions there. On the 23rd of this month, Dr. Harsh Pant will be speaking on global power shifts in India. On the 30th, Dr. Ila Patnaik would be speaking on Atmanirbhar Bharat. And then we have launched this, today's the inaugural launch of the book discussion series. We shall do the book discussion once a month. We're already doing 4 events a month. So I don't want to just make us leave time for people to absorb the wonderful things that are being said. Today is a wonderful book discussion. This book, Indus, Basin, Uninterrupted. It's a very ambitious title that Uttam Sinha has given it, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. And the book is half and half. So half of it is on historical developments. Half of it is very contemporary, post-independence, etc. I'll again not go into the book because we have Uttam Sinha speaking on it. And then we have Ambassador Satish Chandra, who knows this area and this subject very well. He's been our High Commissioner to Pakistan. He's been the head of the National Security Secretariat and Deputy NSA, and a rich background in foreign policy, and especially on these areas. So what I'll do is now I'll request Dr. Uttam Sinha to introduce his book, speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll request Ambassador Satish Chandra to give his perspective on the book. So Uttam, over to you. Your time starts now.
Thank you. Namaskar. Good morning. Thank you, Shakti ji, for the introduction. It's always difficult to speak on a book which you have written. So, but I've been saying this to many of the platforms I've been speaking. So let me again attempt to briefly outline what the book is all about. I'm grateful to you and the team at the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies for hosting this discussion. And probably this is the first of the book discussion you're hosting. And I wish you all the success. Vajpayee to recollect, since this is the Vajpayee Institute. had a very active interest in the development of rivers, particularly interlinking. And I remember, since I was covering largely what he was doing in the international front, he would often say, conserve every drop. And I also remember around 2002, 2003, possibly, he had appealed to the people to, observe July and August as water months, something we tend to forget about Vajpayee, especially by stepping up efforts to clean the rivers and the water bodies around us. I can also recall during Vajpayee's government, and this is very important when it comes to the Indus Basin, is that Operation Prakram happened in January 2002, which followed because of the terrorist attacks on the parliament on December 13, 2001. Now, there was considerable debate, I remember, and Ambassador Satish Chandra would recall, about how we should use the rivers of the Indus Basin as an instrument to punish Pakistan. And this debate keeps coming up whenever India witnesses cross-border terror. But that aside, the book, which I will briefly discuss, is roughly about 353-page book, but that shouldn't dissuade readers from not reading it. And it's divided into 5 parts. The first 3 parts covers the Indus Basin, starting with the Indus civilization, then the medieval and the Mughal period, and then to the very interesting British colonial era and times. The last 2 parts, which Shaktiji mentioned, more contemporary, deals with the partition and the making of the Indus Waters Treaty. And that is fascinating to us even today, because we have marked 60 years of the treaty. The treaty is still alive and kicking. Next year, we'll be celebrating 75 years of India's partition, and therefore there will be a lot of focus on the partition issues itself. And I'm sure the issue of rivers will crop up, and it's an area where I think will encourage a lot of research, because I think even after my deep investigation into the partition period of time, there's plenty of knowledge that still needs to be explored. I must say that the book has been an outcome of my 2 years of sojourn at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, 2018 to 2020. Coincidentally, Satyji was the director then, and we have often had discussions on many of the issues relating to the Indus. And I've been very fortunate to use the enormous archival resources that is available in the memorial, I think. And I've been just fortunate. And I hope many of you researchers, young and old, would get this opportunity to use the rich treasure house of knowledge that the Nehru Memorial hosts. Let me just briefly talk about the conceptualization, and then I will touch upon the content. I think it is a historical book, but it is not written by a historian. And I think this is something important to understand. Now, whether history should only be left to trained historians is debatable, and I won't get into that. But only to say that one should engage with history, irrespective of the discipline one is familiar with. I think it gives a clearer perspective to some of the contemporary issues one is dealing with. And therefore, we cannot be historically ignorant. And the Indus Basin is very typical of this. We often encounter narratives that are not historically correct. And I must also emphasize here that when one attempts a work in history, it is foremost a matter of great responsibility as a researcher, particularly, in not misusing the facts or interpreting information to suit some prejudices. And I think this is an important element of research and a very important element of doing an historical work. So the book, I think, in many sense, does not interpret history. It only narrates history through several historical characters that run along the timeline of the Indus, right till the Indus Waters Treaty is signed in 1960. And that's where the book ends. Of course, that gives me also enormous space to look at the functioning of the treaty in the post-1960 period, which I'm attempting in my second book. This is, popularly nowadays called narrative history, and a lot of writers are engaging in this style. And I'm not talking only about the William Dalrymples and the Ramchandra Guhas, but I do see a new breed of young writers increasingly writing in a narrative history style, which is becoming increasingly popular. Now, the characters that are covered in this enormous timeline, from the Indus civilization to the signing of the treaty in 1960, these characters are, greatly influenced by pride, power, envy, fear, desperation, many a times sheer greed, as we see during the East India Company period. And their actions and consequences have been momentous on the Indus River. And I have recorded those actions through these characters and the development as it's gone along the timeline. In a way, I think, when I was conceptualizing this book, I thought the book should humanize the Indus rather than merely treat it as a hydrological wonder. And I think that's what I have done in the 353 pages of the book. I think rivers itself are very intriguing, the subject. There is, as they say, a history in all rivers, and there is a river in every history. And I think the Indus clearly brings out this aspect. It's an enormously rich hydrology heritage. The more you look into the Indus, the more you find amazing things about it. And you actually then start off from the Indus civilization, which the book does. And there is, therefore, from there on, there is this very intriguing and engaging history of territory and politics that mixes with the Indus Basin, and as the subtitle of my book also points out. Remember, till 1947 and the partition, the basin remained cohesive and unitary. But since the partition of land in 1947, and thereon the intense 8 years of negotiation that led to the signing of the treaty in 1960, the oneness, this hydrological oneness of the Indus Basin acquired a transboundary nature. Never in the history of the Indus Basin had two states looked at the basin from various different perspectives between two sovereign states. And that was, a dramatic change of the basin itself and its profiling. And since 1960, it's been a basin with two sovereign states and the politics involved around it and the management of the treaty that goes along with it. I have attempted to summarize this exhaustive history on page 277 of the book, and I found it enormously difficult. But I'll just write, because I do find this summarization in some sense quite interesting to talk about. The entire history, and I quote, of the Indus Basin has had its dramatic encounters, institutional achievements, and misreadings, disputes, and tales of men shaping their destiny through the vagaries of the rivers. In the long history of the Indus Basin, the Treaty of 1960 will be remembered as a hydro-diplomatic moment, a pause in a potentially conflict-ridden situation. Indeed, I think the basin has a remarkable history, and it still remains a powerful symbol of the passage of time. And it continues, even today, influence and in turn being influenced by the socio-political landscape. Remember, rivers are very territorial in its presentation, and they are highly political, very emotive, and extremely divisive. And this comes out through the history that I have explored. Now, what are the striking themes that emerge? And I'll try to just sum it up. Till 1947, there are three themes which I think comes out quite clearly in the book. Again, developed through the characters and what they thought about the rivers. There is one, I think, a continuity of history in terms of knowledge of water management. Right from the time of the Indus civilization, we've seen the knowledge of water management being accumulated, being passed on, being acquired, being modified, of course. But this knowledge, this historical knowledge of water management continues. And we've seen this during the Harappan period, where they harnessed flood inundation irrigation, which was called the Sailaba. They had dry farming, which was called the Kuskaba. And I record this all in the opening part of the book. There were methods of rainwater storing. And if you look at it today, we always talk about harvesting rainwater. But so that knowledge, I think, has a very important character. It's a continuation of that knowledge, the continuation of water management. The second striking theme that emerges is that water is tied to the idea of political legitimacy. And I think this is across important basins all over the world, whether it's Nile, whether it's the Yellow River, whether it's Mesopotamia. I think this political legitimacy wedded to rivers, and the management of it is quite important, I think. It also symbolizes that water is part of good governance and moral responsibility. And we see this across history. And I record this, for example, the Hindu ruler of Avantivar, the Hindu ruler in the 9th century Kashmir of the Utpala dynasty. And he's labeled as the engineer king. And we're talking about the 9th century here. And this engineering perspective is recorded the way he thought about water management. And his attention to flood management and irrigation was quite critical for his legitimacy. And that is something that I've recorded in the book. Or if you go down the historical line, you find Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who, of course, has been described as the wise fool. And he took many administrative reforms that were quite disastrous. But when it came to encouraging farmers or building wells or water harvesting system, he was quite successful. And he, in fact, was one of the first to have actually established the Department of Agriculture, which he called Diwane-Kohi. And he surveyed the cultivable lands and looked at special schemes and loans to farmers to improve cultivation in Punjab and the Doabs there. In Firoz Shah Tughlaq's period, we find a network of canals developing, which was, of course, further taken by the Mughal rulers and then modified by the British, in particularly in the mid 19th century. The third theme which comes out is that, and this is during the colonial times, the huge emphasis on economic returns from the Indus Basin and the strategic objective of the trans-Indus Basin, especially when the British came into India. When the British looked at the Indus region, beyond the Indus region, the trans-Indus region, they thought it to be a sort of what is described as an imperial migraine. They were quite foxed with the intrigues and the local unrest, and they were very worried about the foreign invasion coming in. Remember, Napoleon, the French fear had really defined the British control of the Indus Basin. Later on, of course, it became the Russian sort of movement towards what they felt was their pride and possession. Now, I think the British power and prestige relied a lot on the way they controlled the Indus Basin. And one of the economic returns they thought about was navigation, which today, unfortunately, is a very missing element of the Indus Basin. And these were very critical drivers for first the East India Company in the first quarter of the 19th century, then later on to the British colonial time. I think in terms of strategic concern, they did view many of the issues beyond the Indus in terms of threats. And therefore, they set up alliances with Persia, with Afghanistan and Lahore. And I record this all in part 2 of the book, which I describe as Indus being the panic zone for the British. And I describe how Lord Minto's 3 wise men, I call them, John Malcolm, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, and Charles Metcalfe, dealt with the complexities of diplomacy in the lands which I think the British were quite unfamiliar with. And they established this diplomatic relationship with Persia, Afghanistan, and Punjab. And I record all that and I observe all that in the book. I think the objective of these alliances was obviously to expand their strategic influence and stop first the French and then the Russians to come in. But what I found when I studied all this, as this diplomatic caravan traveled from one end to another on the Indus Basin, the British recorded very carefully the geographic detailing of the rivers. Its bend, its turns, the landscape, etc. And I think these became very interesting knowledge to understand the profile of the Indus Basin. Of course, there was also a lot of intelligence gathering that happened and the understanding of the social hierarchy as they observed when this diplomatic caravan moved from the Indus Basin to various parts of Persia and Afghanistan. So part 1, part 2, and part 3, you'll find a lot of dramatic encounters, and also observations from the foreign travelers. I've recorded all that. One of the first dramatic encounters that we've always learned is Alexander and Porus on the Jhelum, which was described by the Greek as Hephaestus. And I've observed through some of the writings that Porus was actually the child of the monsoon, and he understood every ebb and flow of the rivers. And he felt that the river could protect him from any invader. Unfortunately, he was defeated. Of course, he was defeated more by the deception and the daring of Alexander and his soldiers. But he didn't have a total understanding of the rivers itself. And I think finally his own understanding of the hydrological profile of the Jhelum failed him to a great extent. There are these wonderful dramatic encounters again with Kazim, the first Muslim invader, coming to India, and how he encounters King Dahar on the river. And I'll leave you for the readers to read this. Also, the Battle of Indus, 1221, between Genghis Khan and Jalaluddin Khwarezmia from Samarkand. Also clearly shows how the rivers were used as military tactics in dealing with battles and invaders, etc. A whole lot of observation of the travelers are there, which of course is of great interest when you see how they recorded the Indus Basin. I think these travelers who came to India were propelled by the quest of adventure and knowledge. And I think we get a considerable detailing of the rivers, the lands, and the people. Part 4 and part 5, of course, it's very interesting because it's very contemporary. It talks about the partitions, the drawing of the boundary. But I think a striking revelation to me, as I was writing this book, was the role of the civil engineers, I think. And that is an understudied area in the partition process. We talk a lot about the national leaders, we talk about these great personalities. We tend to almost neglect, to an extent, the remarkable efforts and thinking of many other actors in the partition process. And for me, I think the civil engineers were a remarkable revelation. Their alertness and diligence, I think. For example, Bikaner State Chief Kanwar Sen, or the East Punjab Chief Engineer Sarup Singh, and even a character called Lala Adjudia, who was the chairman of the Central Waterways Commission. They realized very early on the strategic importance of the headworks, particularly the Firozpur headworks of the Satluj, and how it should remain in India's hand. That's very important. And this was very critical. And as the book accounts, through their memoirs and through their writings and through the letters exchanged, that there was an urgent intervention on the Radcliffe line by these people who had influenced then people like Patel and Nehru. And because of their intervention, the Radcliffe line moved a few crucial kilometers west to India's advantage. Right? And I use many of the correspondence, and it's a fascinating account of how Sarup Singh tells Sen, and then how Sen tells Sardar Panikar in Bikaner. And the role, again, of great interest is Maharaja Sadul Singh, whose father Ganga Singh, who had successfully parleyed with the British administration to build the Ganga Canal and change the entire destiny of Bikaner. And how the Maharaja uses his excellent contacts with Mountbatten in highlighting this very important feature of the headworks coming to India. And in fact, in a letter to Mountbatten, which he drafts with the help of Panikar and Kanwar Sen, he clearly expresses the gravely prejudice that Bikaner will have in terms of the water supply if it misses out through the shift of the Firozpur headwork. I think all that is interesting. It's very intriguing to note. Of course, Nehru is well informed only after the civil engineers put forward this viewpoint to him. And it is later on that he confronts Mountbatten and expresses the strategic and irrigation point of view to him. And then the rest, of course, is history, as the Radcliffe line is changed, much to India's advantage. I think the nationalist argument of the civil engineers were very clearly wedded in both the political and the strategic. And that defined India's right or the rationale as an upper riparian country to establish claim of the waters in its territory before downstream utilization became a prospective right. And I think this has to be observed, and this has to be seen in the context of the strategic value of the waters when the division was happening. There was also a very strong sub-nationalism that had emerged. Of course, there was a nationalist perspective led by Nehru, but there was also a sub-nationalism that was emerging, especially seen in East Punjab and to some extent seen in Bikaner. I think the mood in East Punjab was very provincial, of course, but it was rooted in the ground reality of water requirement that did not reflect the lofty reconciliatory goals of Nehru. And there is a very interesting letter which Nehru writes to the Premier of East Punjab, Gopi Chand Bhargav, and this is 28th April 1947, and Nehru writes, "I'm greatly worried at the stoppage of canal water which used to flow to Lahore district. Whatever the legal and technical merit may be, there is little doubt that this act will injure us greatly in the world eyes." Now, Nehru has this great international worldview of things. What would be the image of India? And he writes, "And more specifically, when food production is so urgently needed everywhere." Now, everywhere was also Pakistan. And here he doesn't really talk about the needs of East Punjab. Of course, he also explains to Bhargav the inputs from the military was also very important. And he writes that owing to the stoppage of water, there is too much water round about Pathankot. And this is coming in the way of our building a bridge, which is so urgently needed. I have little doubt that water will have to be allowed in future because such stoppages cannot occur normally unless there is actual war. To stop water for the fields is supposed to be rather an inhuman act. I suggest to you, and this is Nehru telling Bhargav, therefore, to consider this matter afresh. And this is his famous line of his. He says, "If we act with grace now, although it is getting rather late," he says, "we might get the benefit of it. Otherwise, there'll be no grace left and no benefit." Now, I leave that portion to the reader to decipher how Nehru thought of things and how certain provincial leaders thought about water issues. And I've accounted that in the book. And it's a fascinating account of things. And I based it purely on factual accounts. And there is no what is called interpreting history here. There are, of course, other characters that emerge during the time of the partition and a little bit before that. And I focused a bit on Ambedkar, especially his faith in the strength of scientific and technological process and progress, especially in terms of social upliftment. Remember, he was pioneering in some sense, contributing to water management in the country. And we often forget Ambedkar's role in the planning of the Damodar Valley Corporation in Bengal and Bihar. And this was the first river valley project in India. And so that is well accounted, especially this encounter with Lord Wavell, the Viceroy of India, and Ambedkar stands his ground, especially asking for expertise from the Tennessee Valley Authority, rather than Wavell suggesting to have a British expert who had worked on the Aswan Dam. Of course, Ambedkar had his way, and eventually we do find a large influence of the TVA in India. Of course, the chairman of the TVA, David Lilienthal, had also visited India in 1951. In fact, he had walked the sprawling lawns of Deen Murti with Nehru, and I record that conversation. And gradually and slowly, the TVA and its influence in the multi-purpose river valley projects, gets deeply ingrained in the development projects of India. And that is, again, I have written about that. Also, a bit about Subhash Chandra Bose is addressed in the book, and especially his statement in 1938. Again, here is looking at science and development. And this is the context in which I'm shaping the debate in the post-1947 development that had happened. And there's this statement of Bose in the Indian Science News Association in 1938. He says, "What is wanted is a far-reaching cooperation between science and politics." And I think thereon, the Indian scientific community is quite awakened to science as a task for national purpose. And the TVA fashions into this thinking. Quite ironically, because if you look at the Constituent Assembly debate, there is much disagreement on the whole vision of the TVA. Especially in terms of its application to social development, But yet again, the debate is very interesting because eventually the civil engineers see engineering and the approach of TVA as advantageous to society, and the whole process of taking over national projects to advance what is called a modern state. Then, of course, very interesting, and since World Bank was a very important actor to the Indus Waters Treaty, there's a whole
Uttam,
lot
could you
of...
start slowly winding up also?
Yes, and there's a whole lot of impression about the World Bank. Again, very ironical, because remember, the World Bank had little political or ideological appeal, in the Indian system, and it was rather scorned as a capitalist and agent, and yet eventually we find in the 8 years of the negotiation process that happened that the World Bank played a very important role in shaping the treaty. Of course, there is a lot about Nehru. There are fascinating aspects on how, particularly how Nehru prevailed over the debate in Parliament, and you'll find that in the sections called Heated Debate in Lok Sabha, and a particular section called Nehru Convincingly Unconvincing. And I'll leave that to you to read it. I'm not going to talk much about that, but only to say that Nehru was supremely confident of his worldview. And while he would listen, he would eventually be the master of his own thinking. And that we find when he talks about the Indus Treaty. Eventually, when the treaty was signed, and I will end here, the goodwill and the friendship with Pakistan that was hoped to usher from the generosity and sacrifice that the Parliament often talked about, came to a blow as Ayub Khan, soon after signing the treaty, talked about the physical position of the upper reaches of the Indus Basin rivers and refused to talk about the Kashmir problem. And today, we still live with the treaty. Thank you, Shaktiji.
Thank you, Uttam. You saved a lot of people the need to go through 350 pages by capturing so much of the nuances so carefully and so systematically. So I think that does help us understand the book so much better. Now request our discussant, Ambassador Satish Chandra, to give us his reactions, his perspective on the book, what it has, what it doesn't have, where he agrees, and obviously where he feels differently. Over to you, sir. You're muted. You'll have to unmute yourself. Not yet. It's still showing red against your name. ऊपर right side में होगा कहीं. हाँ हो गया. Now it's fine.
Okay, fine. Shakti, first, many thanks for inviting me to your institute. And I'm particularly delighted to be here because it is named after former Prime Minister Vajpayee, someone whom all of us greatly admire. And I had the privilege of working with and interacting with him since the time he was Foreign Minister in an earlier incarnation in the 70s. And I'm particularly happy that this event is taking place at this institute. The book Indus Basin Uninterrupted is undoubtedly a remarkable book. It is remarkable because of the sheer grandeur of its speech. It's in just about 350 odd pages. It covers the major happenings in the Indus basins over the last 3,500 years. It is remarkable because though lengthy, it is still eminently readable and has a light touch throughout. It doesn't degenerate into turgidity. And so it is eminently readable. It is also remarkable because it is based on a wealth of contemporary records, which give it a great authenticity. I am somewhat in favor, I must confess, of this book. I am biased in its favor for two reasons. One, because I have known Uttam for 2 decades and we have interacted earlier. And the second, because I have an embryonic association with the Indus Basin. I was born in Lahore. My forefathers hail from Multan, and I have been dealing with Pakistan for decades, and I've visited Pakistan very often. So my linkages with the area are fairly considerable. The book is in 5 sections, and I'll walk you through these sections. The first one, titled Settlers, Invaders, and Successions, really focuses on the earlier part of the history of the region dating back to the Indus Valley civilization. And some of the things that are brought out very well in this section is the unpredictability of the area and the productivity of the area and the need which successive habitants of the area have done is n number of hydrological interventions, some of which Uttam had named. And there is a series of this throughout, and they had to do this. Another point which has been brought out well is that the Punjab has been the staging point for invaders into India and it became a melting pot, giving rise to a composite culture which bore the imprint of every age and every race and culture with which it interacted. And thus, that explains why Punjabis are perhaps supreme pragmatists, because they are resilient to survive. They have to do n number of things, and they are a melting pot. The section also, as the title would suggest, draws attention to a series of invaders from the Assyrians through Alexander to Muhammad bin Qasim to Babur and so on and so forth. Number of invaders have been listed. But the point that I think we need to note, and to an extent has been covered in this, that the flow of movement wasn't just from the west to the east. It was also to an extent from the east to the west. And most notably, this was Chandragupta Maurya, who in fact crossed westwards of the Indus and captured parts of Afghanistan. The Mughals did it as well. The British, of course, did it. But I think we need to also note that the Sikhs did it too. They didn't really go into and take over control of Afghanistan. But what they did was they crossed the Indus and took over Attock and Peshawar, which traditionally were under Afghan control. Here is where I want to suggest that I have a point of difference in the book, because it says that Afghan-Sikh rivalry initiated the settling of a formalized border between India and Afghanistan by way of the Durand Line in 1893. Strictly speaking, this never was a formalized border. The Afghans, even today, do not recognize the Durand Line. And the British who negotiated it, in fact, the negotiator for the British was their Foreign Secretary, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand, who said, and I'm quoting, the tribes on the Indian side are not to be considered as within British territory. They are simply under our influence in the technical sense of the term, unquote. So the Durand Line, I think we should talk of it as a formalized border. We should consider it as a demarcation of spheres of influence as was originally thought about. And this is also reflected in the fact that the British, as long as they ruled the area till 1947, pretty much allowed the tribals to do whatever they liked on this side of the Durand Line. Section 1 is also peppered with a series of delightful quotations. There are any number of people he has quoted, like Ibn Battuta, Al-Masudi, Ibn Shariar. Many I have not heard of actually, like Al-Baladuri, etc. But an Ibn Battuta quote is, I think, even valid today. He says Delhi is a magnificent city, but the Jamna water is unfit for drinking. And that was, of course, for another reason. But he has said it, and I think Kejriwal could learn a little bit from that one. Sludge management and a variety of differentiated irrigation works were undertaken by many, like Lalita Vidya, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, etc. In fact, the Western Yamuna Canal has been attributed to us in the book. But you know, alongside water management, there was also the question of sharing norms. And the Arthashastra has been quoted, rightly so, in the book. or giving some of these norms, and I mentioned three. All water belongs to the ruler. Irrigation should not harm others. There should be no obstruction or diversion of water courses, nor any release from barrages without legitimate cause. And where there is damage, compensation must be given. I mean, these are fundamentals, and they were there in the Arthashastra. Section 2, titled Diplomacy and Commerce, essentially dwells upon the, as has been stated in the book, The Imperial Migraine, the British fear of Russian domination in Afghanistan, and also the fears about Napoleon. I think that these the British, while they did a lot of research, and the researchers have been mentioned, the point is they did not draw the correct lessons. The correct lesson was that the Afghans cannot be dominated, cannot be controlled, and that their fears are highly exaggerated, that the Russians really do not and will not be able to get into Afghanistan. And they did a whole lot of things to prevent it. Uttam mentioned it rightly. Alliances with Persia, alliances with the Sikhs, alliances with Afghans, these were attempted with different degrees of success or failure. But they also did certain terrible things like the wholly unnecessary annexation of Sindh, and the bloody manner in which this was accomplished is given in detail in this particular book. This was something terrible that was done. I think the lesson one should derive from this, and perhaps the book missed a trick in not doing it, is to deal with the first Afghan war in much greater detail. It has been mentioned, but in passing. And I think what this would really show us is that Peshawar, that Afghanistan could have been handled. Dost Muhammad was willing for an alliance with the British. All he wanted was that the Sikh control of Peshawar and Attock, which was contrary to tradition, should be stopped and should be, negotiated with. The British could have done it. They didn't even try to do so. They valued their alliance with Ranjit Singh so much that they did not even attempt this exercise. Had it been done, all this, the annexation of Sindh, the first Afghan war, which was a terrible calamity for the British, only a doctor came back alive. I think this is one of the most significant developments that was there. And it so often happens, it's not only the British, it is the Americans, it's everyone. You do a hell of a lot of research, but you don't derive the right conclusions. And the British did not derive the right conclusions for all the wonderful work in terms of research that was done by the Byrne brothers, by Metcalfe, by Mason, etc., etc., and you can name them. But the point is the lessons derived were wrong and improper. The third section, again, very well titled. I admire the book for the titles as well. It's a telling title, all of them. Colonization, Canals and Contestations. And this is really the irrigation work done by the British in this area during their times. And what is significant is that while the western section, Western Punjab, was very well developed in terms of irrigation works, and there were enormous projects that were done. And I think here's the book has detailed as many as 11 major irrigation projects. Some of them were highly ambitious, state of the art and complex, like the Triple Canal project in the beginning of the 20th century, which entailed transferring a lot of the waters from the Jhelum and Chenab to the Ravi, or the Satluj Valley project also, with 4 barrages and 11 plants. These were really wonders of the time, and hats off to the British for conceptualizing them and for undertaking these projects. This was really advanced hydraulic engineering, which was more or less unique. And Western Punjab, as I remember my father telling me, who was a very senior government official, that this is the granary of India, West Punjab. The rest of India maybe, have no production. We can feed India. And that is what Western Punjab was at that point in time. Uh, uh, Eastern Punjab, however, was not developed in irrigation terms as well. Uh, One of the things that is notable, which the book brings out in very well, and I think this is the high point of the book, are the interprovincial disputes between Punjab and Sindh, disputes between Punjab and Bikaner, disputes with Bahawalpur. And what was happening was that the upstream people were using the water, the lower stream people were worried, will we get it? The Sakar Canal, Sakar Barrage was delayed, therefore. Bhakra was not developed. So things like this kept happening, and the British had a number of commissions and committees to go into this, and a number of them can be listed. I won't do this for paucity of time, but I will mention actually one which captures it, and that was amongst the very first one related to the Sutlej Valley project. And this is Sir Claude Hill, who represented the government of India on this issue, where the water was being contested. And he says, these waters should be distributed in the best interest of the public at large, irrespective of provincial or state boundaries, subject always to the provision that established rights are safeguarded and compensated, that full and prior recognition is given to the claims of riparian owners, and that their rights in existing supplies or in any supplies which may hereafter be available in the river below the junction of the Beas and the Sutlej are fully investigated and are limited only by the economic factor. So, here was a thing, and it could be done by an imperial power if the whole area is under single political control, which it was, of course, during the British time. The section has a wonderful expose on the very high quality Indian engineers. Uttam has mentioned it, like Vishweshwara, A.N. Khosla, Kumar Sen. I happen to know Kumar Sen because since my childhood, because he was my sister's father-in-law. And so the story that he mentioned about Kumar Sen, I had heard it firsthand from the person himself. So that is this particular section. The fourth section comes on to partition of lands and rivers. And this dwells on two things basically. One is the Radcliffe Award, and the second is the first dispute, which started off between India and Pakistan as independent countries on the river waters. Now, one of the things the book misses, and I think it shouldn't have been missed, is the Holocaust of 47 and what it did. I was one of the affected parties, so I was lucky. I didn't lose any immediate family relatives. But, this was a major event in the basin. There was a death toll of around 2 million and a movement of population combined of about 15 million. And this was really the event of the time. And it was an eminently preventable event. Of course, to prevent partition itself would have been ideal. But even if partition was there, this should not have happened. And in fact, my father was dealing with it, and he told the highest in the land, notably Mr. Nehru and Mr. Patel, that kindly move out the Hindu population and Sikh population from West Pakistan immediately. This was in June 47. Because if you do not move them, you will have a Holocaust of the type that you have not known before. This warning was ignored. My father was dealing with the refugee problem since June 47. So he was from West Pakistan. So he knew the story. But this was not looked at by our leaders. This section is very rightly critical of the Radcliffe Award on many grounds, like the transfer of Chittagong hill tracts and Khulna to Pakistan, then East Pakistan, because they were Hindu majority or Buddhist majority areas, and the transfer of Murshidabad to to East Pakistan also. This again was wrong. To India. This again was wrong because it was Muslim majority. But the suggestion in the book that Gurdaspur was transferred to India because India wanted Kashmir is not correct. Uttam, it is borne out by facts, and I quote V.P. Menon's book on this, that India was quite prepared for Kashmir to go to Pakistan ab initio, should Hari Singh opt for Pakistan. And Mountbatten had told this to Hari Singh. And it is, therefore, we had no interest to having a route to Kashmir at the point in time the Radcliffe Award was given, which was, of course, it became effective on 17th August, in fact. But so that was no interest. But also, I think where you have missed a trick, Uttam, and I say this because we are good friends, is that the sources you have cited for this are tainted sources. You've cited Zafrullah Khan and you've cited Stanley Woolpert. Stanley Woolpert we all know, and Zafrullah Khan we also know. So these sources are not authentic. I'm citing V.P. Menon. So the other thing, of course, is that you're absolutely right on the Firozpur issue, and I won't go into that. It's a point of detail. Mr. Kumar Sen got to know it and moved heaven and earth, and he has told me personally of what was done in the matter, and that is correct. Absolutely 100% correct. This would not have come to us. Now, on the dispute, I'll be very quick on it because I want to devote my time more to the Indus Waters Treaty. On the dispute, to put it, it's a very complex dispute. What basically happened is that in 1947, there was a standstill understanding between India and Pakistan that how the waters are flowing will continue to flow till there is a future understanding. In December 47, there was an understanding between the engineers of India and Pakistan that we will continue the supplies unaffected till April 48. This was agreed to on both sides. There was no indicator given to India that Pakistan wanted the flows to continue. And hence, the use of some of the canals was curtailed by India in 48. And there was then the problem, which was resolved by an inter-dominion agreement in May 1948, where there was a wonderful agreement concluded between the two sides on the basis of discussions between the chief engineers of the two sides, which provided that these waters will be continued till September the following year. That what will happen is that Pakistan will pay water charges. Initially, it was not only for maintenance costs, but capital costs, interest, etc., which they reneged on in the agreement, in the inter-dominion agreement. But the flow of water was remained untouched, and they did not ask for additional water. The book describes in detail the tortuous manner in which Pakistan stopped making payments, in which Pakistan also got out of the agreement, which had an unlimited time frame. And incidentally, one of the additional things in the agreement was a recognition of the rights of the upper riparian for utilization of waters, and on the basis of a reciprocal agreement by India, that we will not cut off the water suddenly. Pakistan got out of this agreement. I won't go into the tortuous details because they are really tortuous. And the book has summarized these accurately at well. I will now come to the final section where I have certain differences of opinion with the author. And the chapter is titled Making of the Indus Waters Treaty. It deals not only with the treaty actually, but AIPRIS also touches upon the problem of Kashmir, and it's being raised by India in the UN. And it makes the point where it suggests that this UNCIP resolution, actually it says UN Security Council resolution, that isn't correct. It is really a UNCIP resolution of August 1948, which basically said that on vacation of aggression, there would be a plebiscite. And the author, the book contains that this wasn't, given the circumstances, unfavorable to India. Let me put it to you that it was unfavorable to India because India's primary complaint remained unaddressed. Notably, the fact of aggression. That was the issue on which we went to the UN. And that fact was obliterated totally, never looked at, and India should have walked out of the UN, in my view, on this particular issue. But I think that is factually incorrect. Now, coming on to the treaty itself. The treaty went the way Claude Hill and company were talking about, which I referred to earlier, and the Arthashastra, that you treat the whole project, the Indus Basin, as one complete whole and divide or use, not even, I won't always use the word divide, utilize the waters to the best interest, rationally. Now, this is the process that was started off in the negotiations with the World Bank, India and Pakistan. And within 2 years, the World Bank very quickly learned the lesson that you can't really deal with Pakistan because they put a blocker on everything, which holds good even today and has been the case ab initio. So then they said, okay, let us see what are the requirements of each area. And Uttam is right in praising our engineers that they were very high quality people technically. There's no question about that. But I don't think they were very good negotiators. And it is astounding that we have 40% of the Indus Basin and we ultimately got 20% of the waters. But why did that happen? Because our negotiators, when they were asked to submit what India's requirement was, they said there is a total availability of 119 million acre feet. 29 should only come to India and 90 to Pakistan. Why are we being the devil's advocate and promoting Pakistan? As an engineer, as an Indian, I won't do it. Pakistan, of course, went even more further and asked for even more. We ultimately got a little bit less than what we asked for. But we asked for it. Why did we ask for less? And Uttam has indicated in the book that he is intrigued. Now, let me try and give you an answer which is not substantiated by any facts, but is based only on a very strong hunch. And that hunch is that our engineers, many of whom were connected, like A.M. Khosla and Mr. Kavarsek, they were connected with Bhakra. This was something which we wanted, and Bhakra is a great project. But we wanted to have absolute no impediment in Bhakra. And that's why I think our engineers gave in to a terrible treaty where we have very much less water than is our entitlement. And not only that, we allowed Pakistan to get $870 million at that point in time, and that's 1960, for renovation and substitution works, of which we contributed $174 million. We paid for Pakistan's works. I mean, this is crazy, absolutely crazy. So I think our negotiators were not on the ball, frankly. And if you look at the Pakistan side, they had a very senior ICS officer who had worked under my father, Mr. Muinuddin. I think he's 31 or 32 batch ICS or thereabouts. My father was 22. But G. Muinuddin was one of their chief negotiators, a very suave and careful customer. And he became their chief election commissioner for Ayub Khan's election. But it was G. Muinuddin who was their negotiator. On our side, we had a very good engineer. But it was an engineer who negotiated it. And I think we missed several tricks. Now, the final point, and I will crave Shakti's indulgence here, because I want to elaborate a little on this. The author very strongly has defended the treaty. I know this because Uttam has always had this line. I have been with him at other places, in the international conferences and Singapore. I know his line, but very briefly, these are the points he makes. The treaty has survived numerous conflicts. The treaty alone made possible the construction of many hydraulic works like Bhakra. Pakistan has never advocated abrogation or revision of treaty. Treaty never had any overriding political objective, and the framers negotiated differences between them by balancing the water rights of Pakistan without compromising on India's needs through concessions, and India has woefully neglected utilization of western rivers as per its entitlement. I only agree with the last point. I think we have not utilized the western rivers fully, and in Mr. Vajpayee's term, we had started work on the eastern rivers. This was, I'm grateful to Mr. Vajpayee that he took what we said very seriously and started utilizing some of the waters. We had suggested western waters also, but at that time it wasn't done. Now, my brief response in seriatim to each of the points. The fact that the treaty was not abrogated or suspended is entirely due to Indian pusillanimity. Any other country under constant terror attack by Pakistan would have done so. And upper riparian, it was entirely up to India to have made whatever structures we want upstream on the rivers that flow through it. No upper riparian has made the type of concessions that India has made to a lower riparian as we have done to Pakistan. You take the case of China, you take the case of Turkey, you take the case today, and it's in the newspapers, of Ethiopia. They are going ahead with the project on the Blue Nile despite the objections of Egypt and Sudan. Now, we are upper riparian. Our primary responsibility is to the people of India, not to the people of Pakistan. Third point, Pakistan, in fact, has on occasion expressed much unhappiness. They have not formally asked for abrogation. But I have been at conferences in Pakistan after I retired, track 2, and they have really gone hammer and tongs against the treaty. They say it's a terrible treaty. 4, it is erroneous to say that the treaty had no overriding political objective. And I'd like to quote here Gulati, who was our chief negotiator. He's written a wonderful book on the Indus Waters Treaty, which I think everyone should read who wants to know this, because he was a very good engineer. But he has said that he met Nehru on his last day, on Gulati's last day on office, which was 28 February 61. And Nehru, in a sad tone, commented, he comments that he had hoped that the treaty would open the way to a settlement on other problems. But we are where we are. And Gulati concludes that this perhaps marks the beginning of Nehru's end. To contend that our needs were not compromised in the treaty is not correct, really. As I said, we got only 20% of the waters. Our legitimate entitlement, because of the basin spread, was 40%. All the concessions were made by us. And you know, something we forget. The treaty was so badly drafted that even we were debarred from claiming our dues for the waters that we supplied to it. It is mentioned that specifically in the treaty. The treaty was that flawed. And Gulati should have known about it because he was the engineer dealing with this issue. One last point I want to make on this, on how much the treaty is hurting us. And this is something on which one has worked. All of you who deal with water are fully aware of it. All our projects have been stymied for years on end, in fact, decades on end. The project on the Jhelum, the Tulbul navigation project, which would have had a zero water effect on Pakistan, till date hasn't been done. As Joint Secretary Pakistan in the 80s, I was pushing for this project. Aaj tak nahi hua. Salal got destroyed because of the terms that Mr. Jagat Mehta, Foreign Secretary, agreed to. I mean, let's face it, this treaty is no good, and I could go on for length, but then Shakti will start cursing me for that. I won't do that, but I could speak at length on how many of our projects got destroyed, of how badly the World Bank has behaved. The World Bank, one project which was for expert groups, they simultaneously, because Pakistan asked, also sent it for arbitration. You have two dual processes going on side by side. I mean, it's crazy. So sorry, on the Indus water speaking, I am a fundamentalist, but I'm happy to be one. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the book. Uttam, may I suggest that we have a private chat at your convenience? Because I have some suggestions for improving this book should you wish to break out a second edition. I didn't go through that. I've listed it in my paper, but I will be happy to share it with you and I think you can improve the book. Thanks a million and I've been truly grateful that you gave me this opportunity, Shakti. Thank you.
Thank you thank you very much, both of you. I think I, of course, had lots of questions, but let me say, unfortunately or fortunately, Ambassador Satish Chandra has raised exactly the same points. And especially if you look at page 262 or 263 of the book, the fact that the canal colonies that Chandra mentioned, and the uneven development in Western Punjab and Eastern Punjab, to the extent that of the Indus Basin, only 20% of the Indian part was irrigated. Well, more than 50%. Now, 50% of any basin irrigated is possibly the maximum. No basin actually gets irrigated more than that, And canal colonies actually led very substantially to the strengthening of the Pakistan process, something which is understudied, The increased recruitment of the Muslims from West Punjab and NWFP really created, during the Second World War, a momentum that despite the Congress, the British no longer ruled India because they had the army recruitments going, That came from the canal colonies. And therefore, the British nudged the Americans post-independence and the unequal treatment that we got, that we landed up paying the Pakistan a substantial sum of money. What we needed had to be a loans to us, not grants. What Pakistan got was grant. Absolutely flowed from that same pre-war and continuing Cold War perspective. That was, to me, I think the agreement has outlived its utility if they ever had one. It had one. India needed World Bank assistance in the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. You had your hands tied. I think the time has come now to really seriously look at it. I mean, Russia gave a commitment to Ukraine. We will not touch you if you give up your nuclear weapons. Ukraine did it. Russia has violated it. China has violated agreements. The fact is, an agreement like this, we doesn't even have an escape clause. Most agreements have an escape clause of renegotiation or getting out. This agreement does not have an escape clause. Lots and lots of issues. I'll not take time. We've actually done a longish session. If there are any questions anybody has, I mean, as I said, I'm fully convinced the questions I had have been raised and answered, so I have nothing to add. Is there anybody who wants to say something? I'm looking at the chat box. I don't see a hand up or a chat up. People have complimented it. Fascinating book.
May I ask a generic question, sir? This is not
very quickly. Yes, Dr. Nandini Bhattacharya, please.
This is very generic question, Uttamji. It's a fascinating book, actually, groundbreaking. So I have little idea about what you have worked on. So it is from my curiosity, I'm asking the question. That is, one, the changing policies over dam and irrigation, in the pre-colonial period, through different regimes, and from pre-colonial to colonial. How did it affect the ecology, or how ecology was considered or not considered in the changing policies? It is a very generic question because your canvas is very large. If you can find it in the Indus Basin area. Secondly,
I think Uttam answered it very simply. It wasn't considered. Okay, yes, go ahead. Yes. The second question.
The second is the British discontinued the traditional water management technology system. And my question is that the early colonial early post-colonial state, did he blindly follow the colonial policies, or there was any major revision keeping in view some of the considerations? For example, the ecology, for example, quote unquote civilization, progress of civilization. Thank you, Uttamji.
Uttam, over to you.
No, I mean, thank you for the question, Nandini ji. I think, well, if you go back to the times where hydrological interventions were being made, there was undoubtedly a larger emphasis on technology and methods of extraction and the larger benefit that could occur through the supply of waters to the field. I really don't think in ecological consideration or such kind were ever thought through. What was considered was more water to the wasteful fields, and therefore, in terms of technology, a greater degree of food production, and therefore a larger imprint of the colonial rule. I think that was important. And I think that's a period of time where we see considerable dam constructions and irrigation, particularly in South India. And Joseph Cotton is clearly the man driving this force. I think it gave them political sustenance. It gave them a certain political legitimacy. And I think, therefore, the emphasis on technology and engineering ways of extracting water and supplying it was far more considered than the ecological aspects. Of course, the ecological aspects are very considerable and a significant aspect now when you look at the basin in terms of the impact that climate change has had and the significant changes in the flow of the rivers that is happening. I think there's a great consideration now on what is called watershed management rather than just the sharing principles of the rivers. And that's because we have a greater degree of knowledge now with us, a greater understanding, far more assessment of what the rivers are doing and how they're being impacted. So yes, did we copycat the whole Western colonial ways of canal development, irrigation, dam? Yes, partly, as you saw the debate in the Legislative Constituent Assembly, I think we did. I mean, it's an ironical situation for us because while ideologically we did not agree with the TVA or the World Bank, yet we incorporated it into our system. And that's why the debate, and I would like you to read that part, where the whole debate is happening and people are expressing their fear and the anxiety about such Western cooperation with agenda-driven motives coming into India. Yet, eventually, the whole need and requirement of dams for development was so critical and crucial that I think at the end of the day, if we sacrificed the Indus Water Treaties, it was basically to retain the eastern rivers. And I think, therefore, I would say, and Ambassador Satish Chandra, we often argue, I would rather take a middle position here, that despite the treaty being bad, we made it worse by not utilizing the provisions of the treaty.
Fair enough.
And I think if we had utilized the provisions more carefully, and I'm going to do that more seriously in the next 60 years, which I do in the book, and I will be therefore meeting and interacting with Ambassador Sir more frequently, that if we had been far more foresighted in understanding what the provisions meant to us, I think we would have been in a far greater and a better position than we are now. I think it's because we did not utilize the provisions, the Pakistanis have always got an upper hand on us. And today we have run into a situation where all projects are taken to the court of arbitration. And we are often left quite high and dry. Delayment of projects also means huge cost that gets incurred. And I've done a small assessment on that. The number of projects that has been delayed because of, what is called the dispute resolution mechanism, which is incorporated into the treaty. We have suffered quite a lot. And that's my only take at this moment on the treaty. I've actually refrained from making any, as I said, a personal observation. I've just
Uttam, can you hold the thought? Uttam, can you hold the thought? Because there's another question on the treaty itself. Why did you hold that thought? Ashish, can you go ahead with the question very quickly?
Yes, sir. Thank you. This is Ashish Kotodia from the Department of Political Science. Uttam, sir, I wanted to ask you, the Indus River Water Treaty 1960 was signed between the India and Pakistan and the mediation of the World Bank, and which gave Pakistan the right to over 81% of the waters of the Indus and the 5 years of Punjab. But sir, as a leading commentator on transboundary water issues, do you think that the Indus Water Treaty had some political objectives and it wasn't just an exercise on peace building? or it was a classic issue of international mediation, deal with the problems of geographical and irrigation issues between the two nations, because it emerged, especially after the partition.
So that feeds into what Uttam was just saying. So Uttam, you could now continue to give us the perspective on, what was the
No, I would agree.
political angle to it.
In fact, if in Niranjan Gulati, the subtitle suggests, an international mediation, an exercise in international mediation. Look, there was this whole idea, and this is driven by Americans' concern of the subcontinent being a flashpoint, another Korea, so to speak. And that's what and how the World Bank came in. Of course, they were skillfully practicing the art of mediation between two now seemingly difficult countries, especially after the partition. There's a classic example I take also of the Jordan River that was happening simultaneously between Israel and the Palestinians. And there again, the United States of America was practicing water as peace, or water as a catalyst for mediation. So there was this international attention, and the subcontinent, or India and Pakistan in the river basin, was part of that larger reflection, and the World Bank came in. And in fact, there's a lot of details of Eugene Black and his outlook on the continent, which I think you should read through to understand really what was happening. So, of course, it was India and Pakistan and the basin, which had got separated with two sovereign states, but there was a whole lot of international attention to it. It wasn't as simple as we thought it to be, a simple treaty between two countries that were now divided on the basin. There was, I think, through the work I've done, there was clearly a Western approach to how what seemed to be another Korea needed to be managed in the continent.
We have a question from Dr. Manisha Shimale.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sinha. I have a question. I want to know that during the negotiations, this treaty has survived for 60 odd years, and it's amazing to see how far we have come from there. Now, with the growing tension between India and Pakistan, how much of this treaty will be used as a political weapon between the two countries? And my second question to you here is, when you look at the treaty, there is a new school of thought which says that within the treaty, yes, you can utilize the waters, but you can also renegotiate the terms. Within the treaty, there is a clause which allows you to do it. How much of it is actually of value in today's circumstances with the growing scarcity between the two countries? And do you think that the treaty will eventually lead to a future to create a war, or is there a diplomatic tool between the two countries?
Okay, I mean, the treaty has survived wonderful. It's because India hasn't abrogated it. It's very simple. If India had done so, the treaty would not have survived. It's a good question to ask and to investigate as to why India did not abrogate it. What were the reasons? Was it so insignificant that they didn't want to really invest political capital into abrogating a treaty which was hyped as being a fantastic treaty, robust, etc., etc.? I mean, that does require a question. But the treaty lives because India allows it to live. That's for sure. Upper riparian, very few, as Ambassador Satish Chandra is saying, very few upper riparian, share water. Remember, it's sharing of the basin. Very few countries do that. Look at Turkey, look at China. No, they will never share waters. They might have other arrangements on river basin, but sharing waters, very few countries do it. So it's a good way of looking at India's image, values, generosity. Remember the debate in the Lok Sabha, a lot of people raised this question about India's generosity. R.C. Mathur, a congressman, very close friend of Nehru, questioned Nehru on the generosity principle and whether this was the correct thing to do or not. So the debate is interesting, and the whole issue of generosity, which we talk about, was still debated at that point of time even. And Vajpayee was there, the young Vajpayee, newly entrant in the Lok Sabha, questioning the rationality of the treaty, questioning why we are giving away so much to Pakistan and what we are going to get eventually. So these are all captured. You must look at it. Now, the future of the treaty, well, you can have various perspectives on it. Article 7 does talk about future cooperation, and it leaves space for dialogues and discussion, but that can only happen if the political climate is good enough for such dialogue and discussions to prevail. And with Pakistan, I don't think that will really happen. So as of now, I think, and what Shaktiji said, and I fully agree, that I think the treaty has outlived its utility. After all, it's been 60 years. We've maximized, both the countries have. We haven't really maximized, but Pakistan has maximized the treaty. We haven't, and that's unfortunate. So I think this is a period of time where we should be maximizing the provisions of the treaty. And I think the Water Resource Minister, the Jal Shakti Minister, made a clear statement yesterday by saying that we will look at this excess flow of waters from the eastern rivers that are going just freely to Pakistan, and we'll be utilizing that through various projects. There are various projects lined up in Kashmir as a national priority, and I think this government is seriously taking the provisions in the true spirit. And I think that at this stage is the best way to go forward. Utilize the provision before you can think about application.
Sure. Absolutely. I think this book really has added so much to our knowledge, I think, of the whole issue. I mean, both contemporary and, as I said, even pre-partition, to understand that historical development. This book has really brought together a wealth of information and analysis. And even as we may not agree completely what Uttam says, but I think it has really, to me at least, and I'm sure to anybody else who reads the book, this is added to our body of knowledge, something which we really needed to do so, and getting out of these imagined events rather than looking at it from the factual point of view, to bring together a wealth of data, quotations, etc. is. One book which I think Uttam should have used, is my last point, which I'd mentioned, is the Salman and Upreti's, both lawyers at the World Bank, who had an amazing amount of book work on this treaty and other riverine treaties, interstate, intercountry treaties, and to bring out that kind. If you have a future, which I'm sure you'll have a future edition also, in addition to the points raised by Ambassador Satish Chandra, I think you could add to this also. It will really help in being a bit of a comparative this thing. How have other countries solved it or not sorted it out, and what are the differences? What is unique about this treaty? But at the end of the day, we are concerned about present and the future. And absolutely, you're right. We have not utilized what we should have utilized. We have not been strategic in understanding. But so much could have been done. And you people like Ganga Singh in those days could think of it. I think that is someone we should really draw some inspiration for that. So with that, from my side, it's over. I'll now hand it over to Professor Amit Dholakia, the Head of Department of Political Science at the Maharaja Sayajirao Rao University, and our Joint Director of the AIPRIS. I hand it over to him for the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Satish sir, and good afternoon, everybody. Today's session kick-started a series of book discussions that we have planned under the Institute. And let me say frankly, we couldn't have asked for a better start. In fact, it was not just a book discussion, I would say it was a very riveting discourse on a relatively neglected area of discussion in India-Pakistan relations as far as popular debates are concerned. Yes, Indus Valley Treaty is part of scholarly debate, but today's discussion holds importance because a lot of our students may not really be aware about the nitty-gritties of the signing of the Indus Valley Treaty and also the gains and losses for both the countries. And what better way of doing this than listening to the author himself and listening to an erudite diplomat who has been thoroughly involved in the conduct of India-Pakistan diplomacy. So we really had an excellent discussion today, which sensitized us to the fact that not just the civilizational, cultural, and the political heritage and history of India and Pakistan need to be studied. Even the hydrological heritage of India and Pakistan is very much a part of contemporary and futuristic scenario between the two countries. And I must say that it was a very balanced debate because the author's perspective on Indus Water Treaty and this ideological transboundary issues between India and Pakistan were balanced by a different view from Ambassador Satish Chandra. And that is how, I mean, the debates and discourses ought to be. So I'm very happy that today's discussion and debate would go a long way, really, in broadening our understanding, in balancing our understanding of India-Pakistan issues. And I'm sure our foreign policy makers are going to listen to what Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha and what Ambassador Satish Chandra have to say on Indus Water Treaty and its future. Thank you very much, Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha and Ambassador Satish Chandra. Indeed, very sincere, heartfelt thanks to both of you for honoring our invitation and presenting your views in a very succinct but in a very scholarly way. And we look forward to similar dialogues in future. Thanks to all the participants also for sparing your time and being with us. Thank you one and all, and have a very nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anlo.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you
both.
very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Shakti. Great
Thank
to see
you.
you again.
Thank you.